Welcome into the Fighting Saints Report. Jack Milewski and Jim Leitner. As we only had one game this weekend, wasn't planning on it, but the snow, the weather, impacting the travel of Waterloo on Friday. So the Fighting Saints only playing one game this weekend, winning their one game over the Waterloo Blackhawks 4-1. We'll be talking that. We'll be going around the USHL, a busy week for most teams, just not the Fighting Saints. We'll also be talking a little bit of the BioSteel All-American game, which is going on right now. Ryan Beck and Aiden McCarthy participating in that, and going through the first half of the season, as this Thursday will mark the 31st game of the season for the Fighting Saints, so officially at the halfway mark. They would have hit it this weekend, but again, the weather impeding Waterloo's progress across the state of Iowa on Friday. And that's where we'll start. Friday, a rare off day for the Fighting Saints, one they weren't planning on until about 3 o'clock, but I-20 near whiteout conditions, so Waterloo deciding not to make the trip. Shouldn't be a difficult game to reschedule because of the proximity of the Waterloo Blackhawks, but the team finds out at about 3 o'clock that they're not playing, and everyone gets a nice night off, and I don't think their players aren't going to be super disappointed about it, because rest at any point in the season, extra rest is going to be helpful. But that was certainly a game and a weekend series that everyone was gearing up for, expecting a lot of animosity between Waterloo and Dubuque. So it did take away a little bit from that. But yeah, just a rare Friday off for everyone involved.
And it was kind of a Friday night that you couldn't really enjoy because you're stuck inside or you have a shovel out on the driveway. But it's the thing that I kind of like about it is now all the remaining games in the series against Waterloo are going to be single games. They're not going to be back-to-back or home and homes. So I think that might be a little bit more easy to manage for both teams, and it should bring some pretty exciting hockey. And but yeah, it is kind of a weird deal. And you would think, I think Waterloo was probably the shortest trip of all the teams around the USHL on Friday, and they had the most difficult time. But I talked to their equipment manager after the game, and he said they tried Friday, and it was just simply whiteout conditions from Waterloo about halfway over, and really didn't make any sense to make that trip. And they were planning on staying the night. They were all ready to go. They were packed for staying overnight instead of making two trips, but they just the bus driver decided that it wasn't really worth the risk. And you got to agree with him there. I mean, he's putting 30, 40 kids' lives in his hands by taking the bus, and I think they made the right call. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see hockey on Friday night, but I think that was the right call.
And Saturday, we did get hockey. The weather got out of here pretty quickly. Roads were perfectly fine by Saturday morning, so Waterloo had no problem making the trip. And Saturday night started off exactly how all these Dubuque and Waterloo games have started off, at the Mystique Community Ice Center. It was 1-0 after one period of play. Dubuque was able to get on the board first. Dubuque has now scored the first goal in every single game they played against Waterloo 5 times this season, and they got on the board pretty early in the game. And for the Fighting Saints, it was a great defensive start to the game, and the defense, I thought, kind of, Waterloo created their chances towards the end. It wasn't a shutdown at the beginning, but that's when Eric Portillo, towards the end of the game, became the main line of defense and was phenomenal.
Yeah, I think they gave up a lot of shots. They got outshot badly in that game, but I think it was more like a bend but don't break defense, because you really look at when the game was still kind of in doubt. The Saints really weren't giving up a ton of grade A scoring opportunities. I can't think of any, maybe one or two odd man rushes that they gave up, which is a very good improvement over previous games that they played against Waterloo. They didn't give up a lot of odd man rushes, which is huge. And I do think, at the second half of the third period is when Waterloo really picked up their offense and really started having a greater sense of urgency. But by that time, the game was kind of already decided. I mean, it was going to be a monumental comeback, 3 goals down to come back. But yeah, I thought it was a really good bend but don't break defense, and they really kept Waterloo to the outside.
Yeah, Reese Gaber scored the 1 goal in the first period, and we said in the first period and the second period for different reasons that the shots were kind of misleading for how that game, because Waterloo outshot Dubuque 15-6 in the first period, but that play felt just about even. Then in the second period, Dubuque actually was only outshot by 2. Waterloo had 9 shots in that period. It felt like they got way more chances than they did in the first period, but only 9 shots versus 15. So the shots weren't necessarily completely indicative of how that game went, but I do think that overall Waterloo had probably more time in the Dubuque zone. The Fighting Saints offense just very opportunistic with their chances.
Yeah, I think this was probably, of the 5 games in the series, this was probably Waterloo's best game. I think the first 2 games here against Waterloo, I think Dubuque deserved to win those 2. They just kind of struggled a little bit in the third period, but I thought this was probably Waterloo's best game and their best opportunity to win. But that's kind of how it goes in hockey sometimes. The team that plays better doesn't always win. But again, I think what was really beneficial to the Fighting Saints is they got an early lead and they built on that, and they didn't allow Waterloo an opportunity to hang around. The first 2 games here, the 3-2 losses to Waterloo, they let Waterloo hang around. And the Saints didn't really do that. They just kind of kept pushing and scoring and building that lead. So it wasn't a game where, it was a one-shot game where Waterloo could get back right in it. And so that's, I think, a big key, too, is they played with their foot on the gas the entire game.
And that's the next thing I was going to mention. In the 2 previous losses to Waterloo, Dubuque was up going into the third, but it was only a 1-goal advantage. This time they had a 3-goal advantage, and we talked about it in the game how when they were up 3-0 at the 6:38 mark of the second period, we said, boy, if they can get this 3-0 lead into the break, that would be huge. 3-1, still a good advantage, but if you had kept that 3-goal lead, which they ended up doing, then you can afford to give up that shorthanded goal that Dane Montgomery scored and still possess a sizable lead, whereas if it's a 1 or 2 goal lead, suddenly that one makes it a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, and it creates a greater sense of urgency for Waterloo, and maybe they start taking chances or, pinching a little bit more than they normally should have. But again, when you have that comfortable lead, I think it's a little easier to play defense too. A little easier to play that bend but don't break defense, and I think that was a big key too. And you could just sense, I just sensed that there was a lot more confidence in the Fighting Saints Saturday night as opposed to those other 2 games here in Dubuque. Those other 2 games, you're kind of sensing like, oh boy, what's going to go wrong, or here we go again. But the Fighting Saints just kept their foot on the gas and kept going, and kept building that lead. And by that time, I think by the third period, I think it was a pretty big mountain for Waterloo to climb, and obviously they weren't able to do it.
Fighting Saints victorious in their only game of the week. We'll preview in depth the weekend to come, for the Fighting Saints. It's a 3-3, but quickly before we head to break, another 3-3. Dubuque did not have much success in their first 3-3 of the season, which was right after the holiday break. A tough time to have a 3-3, but they went to Cedar Rapids, played 2 games there, lost 6-5, and then won 3-2, and then in the final leg, which is always the toughest, lost 7-5 to Team USA, who they'll start their 3-3 with on Thursday. It'll be really interesting to see this game against the U17s as opposed to last game, just because of the difference in how much energy the Fighting Saints probably will have this time versus last.
Yeah, I thought, that the last time they played them, they had a lot of energy the first period and a half, maybe 2 periods, and then they kind of ran out of steam. If I'm not mistaken, I think they had a 4-1 lead in the first period. They scored 4 goals in the first period, and they had an outstanding start. And then, I think it was a matter, they tried to get into a track meet with Team USA, and that's a team that skates really well, and they have a lot of energy. So I'm really excited to see this one Thursday night. I'm expecting a different outcome, because I thought Dubuque was probably the better team that night as well, but it was a matter of, I did think they ran out of steam, and that was their 3rd game in 3 nights. It was Team USA's first of the weekend, and then they played the next 2 nights in Green Bay. So that's a huge advantage to a younger team, to a skating team, and I think what we've seen from this Saints team all year is when they've played a team and they understand what a team brings to the table, they're so much better that second game against them. So I'm anticipating a really good week of practice for the Fighting Saints and a really good really good showing on Thursday night.
A slightly shorter week again, as Jim mentioned. It's a Thursday night game against the NTDP U17s. It'll be the third time this season that Dubuque plays Team USA, third time they play the U17s. They will play the U18s once, but that is all the way towards the end of February, just about a week from today, I believe. A week and a couple days from today is when they take on the U18 team in Plymouth, Michigan. And that is as well to start a 3-3 on the road. So we'll take our first break. When we come back, we'll look a little bit more at the rest of the games that Dubuque will play this weekend in Omaha and Lincoln, and also look at the BioSteel All-American game that's going on right now. Again, Ryan Beck and Aiden McCarthy representing the Fighting Saints in that. Welcome back to the Fighting Saints Report. Jack Milewski, Jim Leitner, this Monday, January 20th, as we kick off the week, as we always do, talking some Fighting Saints hockey. We just recapped the brief weekend for Dubuque, a rare one-game weekend. They had 3 of those in the month of October and weren't slated to have another one the rest of the way, but because of Mother Nature, a rare postponement of a USHL game until a date that's to be announced. Likely, from what I've heard, it's going to be a Wednesday night, and again, it's easy to do a Wednesday night when Waterloo is less than an hour and a half away, but for the Fighting Saints, it really won't matter because they won't have to travel. They just have to show up to the rink when the game is scheduled and hopefully be able to take down Waterloo like they did this weekend. We just mentioned the NTDP is the team that Dubuque will kick off their 3-3 against. The U17s rolling into town on Thursday night. Right now, it's been an incredibly high-scoring series. 2 games, 21 goals total between Dubuque and Team USA, and that really bucks the trend of how the Fighting Saints have played and have wanted to play this season. When they're at their best, they're not giving up much, and they're playing more offense off the counter versus trading chances. But both times the U17s have been able to suck them into playing their style of hockey, and I would have to think if Dubuque wants to win this game, they're going to have to be able to control the pace and control the structure in their own zone and not get into a track meet like the last 2.
Yeah, and I think a really good preparation for that was last weekend when they played Chicago. Chicago is an outstanding skating team. You know, they really like to push the pace. They move really well, and I thought the Fighting Saints handled that really well. They didn't get. I mean, they played the pace that Chicago liked to play, but they also shut them down a little bit, and they didn't really allow them to really get their gears going. And I think that's something that's going to be really beneficial on Thursday night. I like the way the Fighting Saints played against Chicago and probably deserved a better fate in at least one of those 2 games. And if they play the way they played against Chicago, I think they'll be fine against Team USA.
And this is a game standings-wise, still a long way to go. As we mentioned, this will just be the halfway mark of the season for Dubuque. And crazy that we've already gone through October, November, December, and most of January. And we're hitting the halfway mark at the end of January. You only have February, March, and half of April left, and you're going to have to fit in that rest of the season in there. So in terms of games, you have a lot left, but in terms of months, you really don't have much time. So all these games are of increasing importance for the Fighting Saints, especially when you think of that and fatigue likely to set in at some point for at least a couple of these games. But when you look at the standings, Dubuque is 5 games in hand on Team USA and are just 2 points back. So if they win this game, they keep the 5 games in hand and they tie Team USA, and they've been chasing them for a long time. It'd be really nice, I think, for the Fighting Saints to push themselves into the 2 spot and maybe go on a little run and never look back.
Yeah, the important stat there is Team USA has 12 losses. Fighting Saints only have 8. Mm-hmm. So again, that 5 games to make up is going to be crucial. And I think the schedule starts, at least on paper, the schedule starting to lighten up a little bit. You know, you look at the first part of January, and they're playing Waterloo and Chicago. I mean, the first Waterloo, Chicago, and Team USA, the schedule said the first 7 games, which is really difficult. And the Saints have had some good success against the teams that are not in that upper echelon. So, you know, you'd like to think that when the Saints make up those games, use those games in hand, they'll be able to catch and pass Team USA. And like you said, if they win on Thursday night, they're tied with them, and they still have 5 games in hand. So I think that'd be a huge thing. But I think the biggest part of Thursday night is when you're playing a 3-on-3, you always want to have that first game. You always want to have success in that first game because it gives you a little bit more margin for error, the rest of the way out. And we saw that first 3-3 at the beginning of or when they came back from the holiday break, and the Fighting Saints, they lost that first game to Green Bay, or to Cedar Rapids rather, and it kind of they were kind of chasing the rest of the weekend. And I think if you go and you win that first game, it builds up a little bit of confidence, and you don't have quite the margin for error. You don't feel like you have to be pushing the rest of the weekend. So I think it's going to be huge to have a big game on Thursday.
And it's a lot of pressure in a 3-3 if you want to win the majority of the games, but it almost is true that you really have to look at sweeping the first two, because with that third game, unless you're playing another team that also is in a 3-3, you're going to be at a disadvantage with the energy level. So it's a lot of pressure, but winning that first game is so crucial because it sets the tone for the rest of the weekend. And really, you don't want to get into a spot, definitely don't want to get into a spot where we lost the first two going into the third. But even splitting, it seems just by the percentages, there's going to be a much better chance that you end up going 1-2 in that weekend versus 2-1 if you go into the final game 1-1.
Yeah, and Lincoln's that third game in that 3-3, and that's a tough team to play against, a tough physical team to play against. So again, you really want to build up as much confidence as you can. And in talking to some of the players after Saturday night's game, they thought they built up a lot of confidence by beating a really good quality Waterloo team that's leading the Western Conference. That gave them a lot of confidence going into Thursday night, and I think that's going to pay big dividends. And it's going to lead to a good week of practice and good preparation for Thursday.
And that was something we mentioned on the broadcast as well, is you really want to win that game if it's your only game of the weekend, because that's the feeling you have in the pit of your stomach, like it or not, for at least the first day of practice before you might skate it out of your system. And you mentioned Omaha and Lincoln, the other two games of this 3-3. Omaha will be on Friday night, and that will be the only game against Omaha away from home. Dubuque has already played them. That was November 1st. Fighting Saints beat them 2-1, but that was an Omaha team that was before this blockbuster trade that they flip-flopped big name players. Rhett Pitlick was on that Omaha team. He is now on the Muskegon Lumberjacks. They got Luke Mobley from Muskegon. They got Nash Nienhaus from Muskegon as well. So you have a couple players completely different on this Omaha team, and by and large, Omaha is a much better team than the last time they played Dubuque. But this will be interesting because very much the same style of play. Omaha doesn't like to try to score a lot of goals. They like to pack it in defensively. So I'd be hard-pressed. There were 3 combined goals for Dubuque and Omaha in that first meeting. Fighting Saints won 2-1. If I'm setting a betting line for this game, I'm probably setting the over-under at goals at 3.5, because I don't think there's going to be a lot of scored with the style of play.
No, I don't think so. And I think, like you said, both of these teams are really good defensively, but I think Dubuque is has the edge in offense. They're a much deeper team, and this is really where the Fighting Saints, really 3 good quality scoring lines makes a big difference, and you can't really rely on one line, or you can't really focus on one line to shut that down. And so I think that's where the Fighting Saints have an advantage in a defensive struggle like we're expecting against Omaha. But I think that's going to be important for the Fighting Saints to go out and skate and keep rolling 4 lines and trying to do as much as they can against a team that likes to play good defense.
I'd have to look this up to make sure, but I can't imagine that other than Chicago and Dubuque, there might only be 1 or 2 other teams that have a 10-goal scorer on their first, second, and third lines. Venuto had his 10th goal of the season on Saturday. He's playing on the third line all season long for Dubuque. You can count Cherametta. He's been a third-line player, but when you have the Jackson twins on your first line, Reese Gaber on your second line, and then Cherametta and Venuto on your third line, you have at least one 10-goal scorer on every single line. I think Chicago might have a 10-goal scorer on their bench who doesn't even play with how good that offense is, but you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find a lot of teams that have 10 goals on the third line.
Well, even Waterloo doesn't. Waterloo is really a dynamic team, and they've been running away with the Western Conference. They don't have a 10-goal scorer on their third line. So, yeah, you might be right on that. Chicago is so deep. They might have a 10-goal scorer on their fourth line, to be honest.
Wouldn't be shocked.
Would not be shocked at all. They probably have 10-goal scorers on the defense corps, too. But, yeah, it's a huge advantage, and I think that's what – the other byproduct of that is when you have that much depth, there are so many interchangeable parts where you don't feel bad mixing lines up or putting, Antonio Venuto, this is the first time he played with the Jackson twins this weekend. He looked perfectly comfortable playing with the Jackson twins. And, I'd be curious to see how many different line combinations Oliver has used this year. There's a lot of them, and I think it's so key when you have guys who can produce when they're put in those different roles, as opposed to putting a fourth line winger on the first line just to mix things up, and you're not going to get as much production. But this way you can change those parts out all you want, and you still get great production.
And the Fighting Saints have gotten production up and down the lineup. The only line that has stayed pretty much consistent now for a while is that fourth one, Middleton, Millette, and Cronin, and they've been very solid. Cronin had a goal this weekend on a great passing play, so they've had a lot of switches at the top of the lineup, but it hasn't been because of the wrong reasons. It's probably very tough to game plan because you're seeing film of all these different guys on different lines for the Fighting Saints. The last game of the weekend will be against Lincoln, as you mentioned. Dubuque has played Lincoln before. They beat them 5-1, and this is going to be an interesting game because, yes, it's a 3-3, but when Dubuque played Lincoln the first time, the Stars were one of the hottest teams in the USHL. They were towards the top of the Western Conference. They're right in the fight in the Western Conference right now, but they've largely been a 500 team for the last 2 months now. A lot of offense, but they take a lot of penalty minutes, and they give up a lot of goals. And Dubuque did take more penalties than Lincoln did the one time that they played this season, which is interesting because you have the most penalized team in the league against the least penalized team once again in Lincoln and Dubuque. But this is a Lincoln team that hasn't been playing as well as they were the first time these two teams faced. But again, third game in 3 days, it's not going to be easy by any means.
Yeah, Lincoln's only 5-4-1 in its last 10, so it hasn't been playing well. It really since the end of November, I don't think they've been playing that great of hockey. But the one thing that I don't necessarily mind about it is if Lincoln plays the way you expect them to play and they take a lot of penalties, that opens up the ice and gives your power play a lot of opportunities. And hopefully you don't get beat up as much as they'd like to do to you. But I think that might lend a hand to the Fighting Saints. Again, I think Dubuque's a faster team, a more skilled team than Lincoln is. And, I think that's if of all the 3 games that you're playing, this is probably the opponent that you'd most like to play on that third night as opposed to the other two. So I think they're going to be okay.
At Lincoln, I should say they lead the Western Conference in penalties. Green Bay and Madison are just ahead of them in the league standings. They lead the Western Conference in goals scored. They lead the Western Conference in goals against. So very much I liken them to Youngstown in terms of a team that can put up goals in bunches, but also gives up goals in bunches. Not quite as poor as the defense from Youngstown, but still Lincoln, that is definitely their Achilles heel. So the Fighting Saints Thursday at home against the NTDP U17s, Friday on the road in Omaha, and Saturday on the road in Lincoln. It'll be a 3-3. Dubuque has 3 more of those coming up the rest of the way this season, so they have a lot of catching up to do in terms of games in hand. That's how they're going to make them up with 3-3s. So the first 2 of the 3-3 will be very important for the Fighting Saints, and every single rest of the series they have that way, it'll be increasingly important to win those first 2. When we come back, we'll look at the Friday night slate that we couldn't really talk about much this weekend because Dubuque was not involved in it, and then also looking at the other games around the USHL on Saturday, giving you a quick standings update. And then, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we'll be looking at the first half as a whole for the Fighting Saints towards the end of this Fighting Saints report. Welcome back to the Fighting Saints Report. Jack Milewski and Jim Leitner going around the USHL. And just like last weekend, there are a lot of teams that were playing actual series this weekend against the same team. When you looked at the Lincoln Stars against Team USA, Youngstown and Tri-City, Muskegon and Cedar Rapids, Chicago and Omaha, Sioux Falls and Sioux City, Green Bay and Madison, and Fargo and Des Moines. And there were a lot of sweeps this weekend. A lot of teams taking 2 out of a possible 2. Lincoln sweeps Team USA with a 6-3 win and then a 5-2 win. So there's that offense, and they actually played pretty good defense to give up 5 in 2 games against the U17, so we know can score. Very impressive. Muskegon won both against Cedar Rapids, and those injuries continuing to come back and bite Cedar Rapids because they were tight games, 3-2, but Muskegon ends up winning both. Chicago continues to roll, 13 straight wins for the Steel. They win 5-4 in overtime on Friday night against Omaha, and then they took it to them 6-1 on Saturday night. And the other sweeps this weekend, Green Bay sweeping Madison 5-4 and 4-0, and then Fargo 4-0 and 6-1 over the Des Moines Buccaneers. So right now, at least this weekend, it's pretty clear who the good teams are and who the mediocre to not so good teams are in the league. We'll start with Lincoln and Team USA because those are two opponents that Dubuque will face this weekend. And this was a good weekend for Lincoln. They're now 16-13, 2-2, so they've created a little gap there between 500 hockey and the rest of the way. 6-3, 5-2. The offense is good, but what stands out to me, as I mentioned, is the defense against the U17 team that puts up goals in bunches.
Yeah, and that was a series where you were really rooting for Lincoln if you're a Fighting Saints fan, because it knocks Team USA down a peg and it allows the Fighting Saints a little bit a chance to catch them a little bit better. But I think you look at the U17s. The one thing that I kind of in watching them, the one thing I kind of question is how well they handle like the tough physical play, and obviously that's a style that Lincoln likes to play. And I didn't get an opportunity to watch those games, but I would have to imagine that the Stars tried to wear them down, and I think that's probably a good strategy against the Team USA U17s because they like to get out, they like to skate. They're a young team. They're not an overly physical team. So I think if you can kind of lean on them a little bit, that's to your advantage. And as we've seen for many years, that's how Lincoln likes to play. And I was a little surprised that they were able to outscore them the way they did and score 11 goals in 2 games.
Yeah.
But again, I think if you wear down Team USA, I think that's your best opportunity to win.
Keeping it in the Eastern Conference, speaking of being worn down, Cedar Rapids, this seems like, unfortunately for them, a lost season, largely because of illness and injury. I don't think this Cedar Rapids team was necessarily going to break into the top 3 ever in the Eastern Conference, even if they were a little bit more healthy, but just being decimated by injuries. They get swept by Muskegon. They did get a point on Friday night, but now at 12-17, 3-1, they're only ahead of Madison in the Eastern Conference. It's going to be a tough second half of the season if you're Mark Carlson and company. Yeah,
and they're 5 points out of a playoff spot right now. And again, I think they're Meehan and Francis, their 2 top defensemen, are out for the season. And Joe Molinar as a forward, I think they had a lot of high hopes for. I think he's out for the season. Yep. So I mean, you're talking about three big pieces to your lineup being out. And if you're Mark Carlson, I don't know if there's a trade you can make. I don't know if there's any big transaction that you can make that will get you over that hump and put you in a position where you can contend for a playoff. And so I wouldn't wonder if they're going to become sellers at the trade deadline if they have some good pieces to do that.
And they do have a couple good pieces. I mean, the one that comes to mind immediately is Grant Silanoff. I don't think there's a team in the league that wouldn't take Silanoff, and he's someone that will be gone to college next year. It was on the fence whether he would even come back this year, so there's no chance that Silanoff comes back the following year. He's headed to Notre Dame. I don't know if there's any team in the league that couldn't find a spot for Silanoff in their lineup. He's definitely one that comes to mind right away, but that's a decision that Cedar Rapids has to make. Are they far enough out of it by the trade deadline where they would shop? Probably the best offensive player on the team. Nikolai Mayorov is the only other player that's probably comparable to Silanoff offensively, but he might be coming back next year for Cedar Rapids, so I don't know if they shop him.
And the other thing is, I think that the deadline to trade import players is, if it's not passed already, it's real close. So you'd have to be on the fence about that. And again, he might come back. But Silanoff is a guy that I expected to have a huge season this year. He's having a decent season this year, but I don't know if there's enough around him to really make a difference. Now you put him on another team that has a few more weapons and he's not relied upon to do everything. I think he could have a real big impact for a team down the stretch. Now, do you want to give up a couple draft picks and some futures to get him? I mean, that's going to be a tough question, but I mean that's a decision that Mark Carlson would have to make. And already he's going to be drafting, as of right now, he'd be drafting number 2. So maybe you make a deal like that and get a couple more first-round draft picks. And we've seen in the past, you get a couple first-round draft picks, a couple high-end, draft picks in a trade, that can change your franchise around real quickly.
Absolutely. And Cedar Rapids, if they again, if all these injuries didn't happen, who knows where they would be in the standings. The other just Eastern Conference series was Green Bay and Madison. And Madison, unfortunately, they remain in the basement. And it's weekends like this that probably mean they will continue to remain in the basement because they're up 4-1 going into the third on Friday night, and they end up losing 5-4. Their goal differential in the third period is -30. If there's any stat that points to the reason why they haven't had a ton of success this year, it's probably that stat. The inability to close out games is monumental.
And, when we saw them the early part of the season, I thought this was probably the most talented team they've had in a while. A lot of Carson Bandel, a lot of good front-end talent. And so I thought this was going to be a year where they'd contend for a playoff spot, but I don't think they're not playing the trademark defense that they've played. That's really been the hallmark of that team for the last few years since they've returned to the USHL, and they're just not playing that defense. And, they've given up 154 goals, which is that last in the USHL? Mm-hmm. Yeah, by a wide margin, and they've only scored 83. I thought they'd score more than they have, to be honest. So I thought they had enough front-end talent that they could be a lot more competitive, but they haven't. And, I was watching the scoreboard on Friday night, and I said 4-1. Good for Madison. They're going to get a win, and that turned around about a half hour later, and I saw they lost. I couldn't believe that happened, but I don't see them getting out of the basement now if they're struggling like that. And again, they're 11 points behind Cedar Rapids, and 16 points out of a playoff spot halfway through. That's not going to be easy to make up.
Mathematically, Chicago has not locked up a playoff spot yet, but Chicago is going to be in the playoffs. There's no doubt about that. And I'm just about ready to give them the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference already because they continue to win. They've won 13 straight. They beat Omaha 5-4 and 6-1. They score 11 goals on a team that's known for playing really good defense. It seems like there's no slowing down, let alone stopping this Chicago team right now. They're 27-4-1, one game over the halfway mark of this regular season. And I don't know right now if there's a team in the USHL that is better than them top to bottom, and that's not really taking away anything from the other teams in the league. It's just that's how good Chicago is right now.
Yeah, that's Friday night. Since we didn't have a game here in Dubuque, that was the game that I watched, Chicago and Omaha. And Chicago did not look as good Friday night as they did the weekend before against the Fighting Saints. I don't know if it's a little bit of a letdown or if it was just a bad matchup or what it was, but they did not look as good as they did against Dubuque, and they found a way to win. Mm-hmm. I think they scored in the final. They scored in the final minute, I believe. I know they had to rally late.
Yeah. They rallied in the third period to take the lead. Then Omaha scores in the final minute, and then Chicago answers that quickly in overtime.
Yeah, it's the Omaha really hung around and really gave Chicago fits. And like I said, I don't think Chicago played as well as they did the weekend before against Dubuque. But then they turn around and they made some good adjustments overnight, and they really pounded Omaha the following night 6-1. And when you score 6 goals against a team like Omaha, that's it really preaches defense. That says a lot. And again, I think that reinforces. You look at the Fighting Saints held them down offensively the 2 games the previous week, and now they're back to scoring 6 goals again. And I think they're as deep as any team the USHL has seen in the last 10 years, and I think they're pretty a safe bet to be the number 1 seed in the East.
Yeah, they a credit to the Fighting Saints because you see the Fighting Saints play 2 games again. They lost both. Chicago is very good. But they only gave up 6 goals in that series. An Omaha team, again, that is very good defensively, gives up 11. Omaha gave up a couple power play goals. Dubuque didn't give up a single power play goal. I think that should give the Fighting Saints confidence, and also just being in those games. I mean, they were in those games to the very end. So certainly a confidence boost if the Fighting Saints are looking at it that way, that they were right there with Chicago.
And one of those goals was an empty net goal.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's strengthens your argument.
Yeah, and they were up in the game at Chicago. Credit to them. They came back with a couple late goals on Saturday to beat them. But, yeah, Chicago right now, 55 points. Dubuque does have 2 games in hand, but even if Dubuque does take those 2 games in hand, Chicago would still be 8 points ahead of them. Just shows how strong they are this year, and how even with the games in hand for Dubuque, they'd still have to do a lot to catch Chicago the rest of the way, 8 points back with half a season to go. It is a hefty hill to climb, especially when the team is Chicago in front of you. Looking at those standings, as I mentioned, Chicago in first, 55 points, 10 points ahead of Team USA with 3 games in hand. Team USA is in second, 45 points, then Dubuque 43, and then there's that drop off to the middle of the Eastern Conference. Muskegon now up in fourth, once again, 35 points in 34 games. Green Bay right around 500. You and I think, both expected, with all the returners they had, Green Bay to be a little bit better this season. They still have some time to turn it around, but 34 points in 32 games, 15, 13, 1, and 3. Then Youngstown, 1 point behind them. They have given up 141 goals, have the Youngstown Phantoms, but they cling to a playoff spot because Cedar Rapids 5 points back with those injuries, and I think Madison is now officially out of it. They are 3-5-2 in their last 10, 0-3-1. So right now, as we've mentioned all season with the Eastern Conference, top 3 seem set. In some particular order, it will be Chicago, Team USA, and Dubuque. And now it's starting to seem like the bottom 3 who will make the playoffs, not set yet, but it's getting closer to set than it was a month ago, with Cedar Rapids really starting to slide 2-5-2-1 in their last 10. Youngstown, Green Bay, and Muskegon starting to seem like the teams that might represent the 4, 5, and 6 seed in the East.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I just, I think Muskegon, Green Bay, and Youngstown have shown that they can win a few in a row. They can string 3 or 4 in a row together, and that's really what's going to get the job done. Cedar Rapids really hasn't had that stretch where they've gone on a nice run, and I think that's really what's going to be the key. They're 5 games under 500. They've lost. They're 12, 17, and 4. So they have a long ways to go. And again, with all the injuries, I don't see Cedar Rapids getting in there. And but I think you're right. I think the top 6 are pretty well really straightened out. The only thing that I kind of question is possibly Team USA might slip to 4. If one of those other 3 teams can go on a run, there's a chance that they could catch Team USA. But I think those top 3 right now they're pretty safe right now. Dubuque and Chicago, I think, are your 1 and 2 seeds, and then I think Team USA will be the 3. The only question about those top 3 is if someone can catch Team USA.
In the Western Conference, Waterloo still clearly ahead in the number 1 spot, even though they lost their only game this weekend. They have 49 points, 9 ahead of Fargo, who is in second. Tri-City's in third, but Tri-City has played 36 games. That's the most in the USHL. They have 39 points, 3 ahead of Omaha and Lincoln, who are at 36. Omaha is ahead of Lincoln, and they have 1 fewer game played. Omaha Lancers are tied with Sioux City for the league lead in overtime losses. So if they can flip a couple of those losses into wins later in the season, they'll be able to make a push. And then Des Moines right now is in 6th, but there's only a 4-point gap between Des Moines in 6th and Sioux Falls in last. And Sioux Falls and Sioux City, who has 2 points, or is 2 points behind Des Moines, both have 2 games in hand on the Buccaneers. This has turned into Sioux Falls bringing up the rear in the Western Conference to really any one of those teams in the bottom 4 could be out of the playoffs at some point this season. If Sioux Falls or Sioux City gets hot, they're going to probably flip-flop with Lincoln and Des Moines at some point this season.
We've seen Sioux Falls get hot, too. Right around Christmas, they were really a hot team, and they've kind of cooled off a little bit. They're 5-5 in their last 10, but they have the capability of doing it. So I would not be surprised to see Sioux Falls jump into that top 6. And for my money, I think Des Moines and Sioux City are going to be the 2 teams that don't make it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Des Moines, when Dubuque has played them, their defense has been a little bit alarming at times. They've given up 120 goals, which is tied with Lincoln for most in the Western Conference. They've got a lot of talent, a lot of scoring on that team, but that defense is something to be wary of if you're the Des Moines Buccaneers, and might be just a little bit too young, a little too inexperienced this year. And the final note before we take our last break, I think Fargo has certainly cemented themselves as the second best team in the Western Conference. Even though Tri-City's just a point behind them, Fargo has 4 games in hand on Tri-City. Right now they're 18-10, 2-2. The only team other than Waterloo that really has that separation in the win and loss column. They have the second best winning percentage by far. And from what we saw when Dubuque has played Fargo, they certainly seem like, of the teams that Dubuque has played in the Western Conference, the second best.
Yeah, I think they're just a more complete team than any of the other teams that we've seen in the West. Possibly Omaha is starting to creep into that conversation a little bit, but as far as from top to bottom, from the net on out, I don't think there are many teams as complete as Fargo. Well, other than Waterloo, obviously. Waterloo's a pretty complete team, but Fargo, I think, is in that same conversation with as being a complete team. Now, Tri-City has shown in the past that they like to go out at the trade deadline and make some big moves. So, there's a possibility. If they get a couple pieces, they could be in that same conversation where there's a complete team as those other two. But, right now, I think Waterloo, Fargo, I think that's your 1 and 2 seeds.
And they are indeed 1 and 2 right now in the standings, and certainly playing like it. They are both 2 of 3 teams in the Western Conference that have allowed fewer than 100 goals. And they both have over 100 goals scored, so pretty balanced on both sides are Waterloo and Fargo. We'll take our final break. When we come back, recapping the first half of the season for the Fighting Saints. Officially, we haven't hit it yet because the 31st game will be played this Thursday, but more or less halfway there for Dubuque, looking at how the first half of the season played out for the Fighting Saints. Welcome back to the Fighting Saints Report. Jack Milewski, Jim Leitner, wrapping things up here as the Fighting Saints are taking on 3 different opponents in 3 different days this weekend. Thursday against Team USA and TDP, Friday against Omaha, Saturday against Lincoln. Before we get into our recap of the first half of the season, I mentioned it, we haven't hit on it yet, but the BioSteel All-America game going on right now, and Aiden McCarthy and Ryan Beck both participating in that for the Fighting Saints. We touched on it a little bit last Fighting Saints report, but this is a tremendous showcase for both of those. It's the USHL team with the 20 best players from the 16 or the 15 USHL clubs, and then the 16th USHL team is the NTDP, and their U18 squad is that other team that they will be playing against. Most of those players are likely to be drafted at some point, and then a good amount of these other players in the USHL. But fun to watch this game, and for those who are tuning in right now, the game's live on NHL Network. Always a good chance for the Fighting Saints to get representation, not just for the Dubuque brand, but even more importantly for these 2 young players to try to cement themselves as legitimate prospects in the eyes of a lot of these scouts.
Yeah, and I think what excites both those guys a lot is they're playing so close to home. Both Beck and McCarthy are within a half an hour drive of Plymouth, Michigan, so they're going to have a lot of friends and family there and a good cheering section too. So I think that's going to be exciting for those guys. And I mean, it is a great opportunity to go out there and you showcase your abilities, but I think it makes it a little bit easier when you get a chance to go home. You have some familiar faces around you. You feel a little bit more comfortable. It brings out the best in you. So I know they're both really excited to play in front of their friends and family. And I asked both of them about, the idea you're playing a team that's been together all year.
Yeah.
The U18 team, and, you're just a group of guys that are thrown together. And, they didn't seem like that was as big of an issue to them. A lot of them have played together in the past. I know Beck played on the Ivan Holinka tournament team last summer, so he's familiar with a lot of those guys. And, they both said, when you're playing with teams or players that have a lot of skill and have a lot of hockey IQ, it's easy to mesh together. So I think Team USHL is going to do all right against the U18s tonight.
Yeah, it'd be fun to watch that again at NHL Network if you're interested in tuning in right now. Looking at the first half of the season for the Fighting Saints, we'll hit it on Thursday. 31 games. Dubuque will either be 22-8-1 or 21-9-1. Either way you look at it, it's been a tremendous first half of the season for Dubuque. They started the season off on a 7-game point streak. They started the season off on a 6-game win streak. And right out of the gates, you and I both talked about it early on in the Fighting Saints report. This had a feeling of a team that was going to do a lot of good things this year. Nothing's really changed my mind through 30 games so far.
No, the stat that really jumped off the page to me when I was looking through it is, right now the Saints are 21, 8-1. So they have 9 losses combined. Only 3, all those games were 1-goal games. Now there were 3 games that were 2-goal losses, but they came because there was an empty net goal. So, all 9 of their losses came down to the final minute, and they all had they had chances to win all of them. That doesn't happen. You're looking at a team like Waterloo, which is running away with the West. They haven't done that. I mean, they've had some bad losses where they've been really, they haven't played well. And again, I look at the schedule. There really hasn't been a bad loss. I mean, the 9 losses, they've lost to elite teams in the league. The only loss that they haven't had to an elite team was Cedar Rapids. And, when you're playing a big rivalry series like that, you're bound to lose one of those games, no matter what, if the team's not as good. But again, it's a lot to be excited about for the second half of the season. When you look at the record, you look at even the losses have been real close, and they've always been in them.
I think that's the stat that's most impressive to me right now is Dubuque only has 1 loss to a team that's not ranked in the top 4 in the USHL right now. They have 2 losses to Waterloo. They have 2 losses to Fargo. They have 2 losses to Team USA. They have 2 losses to Chicago, and then that lone loss to Cedar Rapids. They've taken care of the teams that they need to beat below them in the standings, and the teams above them in the standings, Team USA, Chicago, and Fargo, they haven't beaten yet this year. They won't have a chance to beat Fargo in the regular season. They'll have another shot at Chicago. They'll have a couple more shots at Team USA as well. They've beaten Waterloo 3 times. But again, the games against Team USA and Chicago, even though they didn't beat them, right in them. You mentioned the game against Fargo, right in those games. Very impressive. The stat that I was looking at, and I've looked at it all season, is goals allowed. We talked so much last year about Tri-City and their tremendous defense and how they didn't give up anything, how they were the stingiest defense we'd seen in a long time. Dubuque doesn't get the offensive production that Tri-City got from their defensemen, but as a team, 72 goals allowed through 30 games. They're just off the pace that Tri-City set last year. Tri-City allowed 144 goals in 62 games last season. So if Dubuque posts a shutout in the next couple games, they'll be right on the pace of Tri-City for 144 goals allowed in 62 games, which is just incredible. You look at the rest of the teams who haven't given up 100. It's Chicago, Waterloo, Fargo, and Omaha. But Dubuque is 12 goals allowed fewer than the next closest team in the league, which is Waterloo. It's been a tremendous defensive start to the season for the Fighting Saints.
It has, and I mean, I look at look at the depth chart for the Fighting Saints. They've got 8 defensemen on the roster right now. I don't see a weak link, really. I mean, you've got a lot of interchangeable parts, and that's a nice luxury to have. It's just. And they've kind of switched up their defense partners a little bit too, and they haven't missed a beat. And again, the defense has been outstanding. The forwards coming back have been outstanding, and they've gotten great goaltending. So I think that's a really good explanation why the Saints are so far ahead in goals against. But even like what really impressed me about Tri-City last year is throughout a 62 game schedule, you're going to get beat bad a couple of times. It just happens. You're going to have an off night or 3-3. Tri-City, I don't know that they ever really got beat bad last year. The same with the Fighting Saints. They've never gotten beat bad. They've had, like I said, they've had 3 2-goal losses, but they were all empty net goals in those games. So they've hung around. Their defense has been outstanding. And again, you have 3 really good quality scoring lines. That's a great recipe for success.
Moving forward to the second half of the season for the Fighting Saints, in general, Dubuque's a team and an organization that doesn't make a lot of moves at the trade deadline, but it seems like this year is going to be a real instance of you're not going to make any trades, and there's not really a reason to make trades. And the big reason why, I mean, other than the fact that you're 21-8-1 right now through 30 games, but it's because of the play of guys like Ryan Beck and Stephen Halliday, who were on the team to begin with this year, but have just started to round into form where they're showing their true potential. Halliday has 11 points in the last 10 games. Beck has, I believe, all but one of his points have come since midway through November. So these are two players that are just starting to figure it out at the USHL level. It's almost like adding two different players at the halfway point of the season. Again, they were on the team, but they weren't playing at this level to begin with. Now they are. Halliday's been a difference maker every single night for the last month. We saw it again against Waterloo. And like you said, it's not just that he's doing this against teams that are in the bottom of the standings. He's making impressive moves and putting up good performances against teams that are at the top of the standings as well.
Yeah, and I think, I go back to Saturday night. I thought Waterloo did a pretty decent job of controlling the Jackson Twins or limiting what the Jackson Twins could do. And then they kind of give Halliday a pass to go all the way down the left wing and take the puck to the net and score. And that's what I really like is there's so much good scoring depth on this team. And, I like in my job, I've covered a lot of championship teams in a lot of different sports, high school, whatever level. And I've always said the teams that have the most success are the ones that have some nice star players, but they have so much depth. They have, like during a tournament run, I'll talk to 10 different kids, about what they did in a particular game, and that's why they have success, because you can't, you don't just rely on one player. And that's really what I've seen here from this team here in Dubuque is, they have their stars, but they have a lot of them. They have a lot of balance. They have a lot of depth. They have a lot of guys who understand their roles and do it. Even that fourth line, even though their production isn't, as great as the top three, they all contribute in different ways, and you put it all together, they have a really good, solid hockey team.
It's been a fun team to watch halfway through this season, and as I mentioned, you're going to be jam-packed the rest of the way with 31 games to play, or 32 games to play, I should say. In roughly 3 months, you're going to be averaging a little over 10 games a month. So this is really where the Fighting Saints will have to bear down. But as you have mentioned earlier, the schedule does lighten up a little bit. They're going to be playing a lot of these teams that are below them in the Eastern Conference standings a lot more the rest of the way. There's no doubt that the beginning of January was the toughest stretch of the season for the Fighting Saints, where they played the Western Conference leader 4 times. It ended up being 3 times, and the Eastern Conference leader twice to start off the new year. Now you're going to be playing Youngstown 4 times. You're going to get Cedar Rapids a couple more times. You're going to get Muskegon twice more. You still have to play Madison 3 more times, I believe. So this is a Fighting Saints team that is going to have a chance, and now you can't take, that's the biggest thing, it's a chance. It's not a guarantee that you beat these teams, but they're going to have a good chance to get a lot of points, because right now on paper they're definitely better than the majority of the teams they're playing the rest of the way.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think they've the thing that I've liked is when they've played those teams that they're better than, they don't sink to their level. I mean, they win the games that they're supposed to win. And throughout the course of a season, you're going to lose a couple of those games, but so far they really haven't. Maybe that Cedar Rapids game is about the only one that they probably should have won and didn't. But, again, that's a rival. That's a team that you play 6 or 8 times a year, and, you can expect to lose 1 or 2 in there. So I really like the future of this team. And the other thing is, they're in 3rd place right now, and which I think is a good spot for them, because they've had a lot of success, and yet they've had just enough little reminders or little failures where there's enough to motivate them to continue to improve throughout the second half. And we saw that with Chicago a couple weekends ago, where they were kind of punched in the face a little bit, and they said, well, geez, we're not good enough. We're going to have to get better. We're going to have to improve. We're going to have to keep working. And so it's a good spot to be in, where you've had success, and yet you have a little bit more work to do to get over the hump.
Well, at halfway point that we've talked about, it'll officially cross over between Thursday's game and Friday's game. Game 31 on Thursday against the NTDP. That's the next time we'll be talking to you on Super Hits 106. Coverage will start at 6:45, and a rare Thursday night game for the Fighting Saints coming at you on Super Hits 106, and then I'll have the call on Friday and Saturday in Omaha and Lincoln. That's all the time we have for this edition of the Fighting Saints Report. Tune in all 3 times this weekend and catch the Fighting Saints against the NTDP, Omaha, and Lincoln.